Hello. Wow. All right, full house. All right, so my name is Brian Hough. I am the Director of Engineering at New Relic, but more importantly, I'm the co-creator along with Nick Graff and Max Stoiber of Polished, which is a CSS and JS library similar to Compass or Bourbon for you CSS folks. And I am, unsurprisingly, here to talk about CSS and JS. So before I get started, I need to figure out where my enemies and my friends are. So how many of you have used CSS and JS before? Okay, hard to see, but it seems like a decent amount. How many of you use it in production and are very happy with it? No. Okay, I'm going to need you to protect me from everybody else as I go through this talk, because people tend to get a little worked up about this. Before I start, so a friendly disclaimer. There's a lot of opinions in this industry. We all have them, I have them, you all have them. Everybody thinks everybody else's suck. Don't hate me for anything I say. I will try to keep as factual as possible, but some of these are my own opinions and they are all up for discussion and debate. And I will gladly talk to anybody after this talk about anything that I talk about, whether you think CSS and JS is awesome or you want to kill us for creating it and you want to go back to using Sass. That's perfectly fine. All right, so much like when JSX first came on the scene, people get a little worked up. So I've been in the industry for about 10, 12 years now. And a lot of the people that I grew up in the industry following had a lot of fun, interesting things to say about CSS and JS when it first came out. Some of these people are clearly a little more worked up than others. I'd also say a cry for help is probably the most extreme thing that I've ever heard CSS and JS called. So there's a lot of myths out there about CSS and JS, so I want to talk about a few of those for starters, just so we can kind of get those out of the way. So these are some of my favorite quotes from Twitter about CSS and JS. When it first started coming on the scene, I have replaced Twitter names with fake ones to protect the identities of these folks. But clearly a lot of people are very upset at us for bringing this into the scene. So some of the common myths are that we don't know CSS. We really, really hate it or just can't be bothered to learn it. It's the same thing as inline styles. So for those of you who are around in the 90s, remember how that was. We don't care about separation of concerns, and we just like to write everything in JavaScript. So I want to talk about these briefly first. So we don't know JS. So surprisingly, you have to learn a lot about CSS to build a CSS and JS library. If you look at things, whether it's style components, glamorous, glamour, radium, any of those, you can't build these libraries without understanding fundamentally how CSS works. There's nothing magical that we're doing that gets around the fact that we still have to function with CSS. So all of these libraries that I'm going to talk about today and any that you're going to come across have to work fundamentally as CSS. The second is that we hate CSS. We actually love CSS, and this is our attempt to try to move CSS as a platform forward. In a world where we're no longer worried about documents and we're actually working with components, CSS is not ready for that type of implementation. As I'm sure all of you as React developers know, it's the part where the components model really falls down, and this is our attempt to try to show what is possible in hopes that CSS will move forward. The third is it's just inline styles. This one's kind of our fault. Early implementations of CSS and JS libraries did use inline styles. It was ugly. We fired everybody involved. It really will be okay. Four is we don't care about separation of concerns. And we very much do. Wow, we're getting very bright in here. We very much do. If you've seen this floating around, this is how we look at separation of concerns when it comes to React components. It's no longer about splitting a document in 3 separations of concerns, but it's actually on the component level. So a component level will describe its markup, its JavaScript functionality, as well as its styles. So it's not that we don't want to separate these things, we just want them separated from a component by component standpoint as opposed to across the document. And the last one, we probably do really just want to write everything in JavaScript. That's how we are as engineers. But just like JSX, and as I mentioned earlier, this does compile down to CSS, just like JSX is a JavaScript representation of what we want the DOM to be. CSS and JS is a JavaScript representation of what we want the styles to be. So when we created CSS-In-JS as a concept, and I'm speaking we generally as a community, we set out to do a few things. One was portability of components. As I mentioned earlier, the sharing of components, the styles portion was always clunky. The second is portability of styles, which is slightly different, and I'll go into that in a minute. The third is better handling of critical CSS. This is the CSS that is required on first render to show your user a page. And platform agnostic styling. So this is the concept of being able to write code from a CSS standpoint that works both in the browser as well as in things like React Native or React VR. It's trying to deliver on that promise of one code base everywhere. So let's talk first about portability of components. So how many of you have messed with web components or heard of the concept of web components or Polymer or things of that nature? I'll pretend like I can see hands. I'm going to say there's going to be some folks out there. So there used to be this concept called scoped styles, and what that was supposed to deliver was this concept that it was I could write styles for a component, and that component wouldn't have to worry about collisions with other components as far as its styles were concerned. So that was like the primary use case that CSS-In-JS is trying to solve. So if we take this very, very basic component here, how would we style this normally? And what we'd do is we'd write some CSS, we'd stick it in another file, and for any of you who've ever used any sort of React UI library, whether it's like a calendar or a date picker or something of that nature, you've probably run across this. You have to take that CSS file and you have to stick it in your styles folder, and if you're using Sash, you import it or you cut and paste it in another folder. It's not the best way of doing it. You're going to require that somebody do something manual. You're going to require that they have some sort of specific build if you're, say, using something like Webpack to pull it in via an import. It's not the greatest way to share your UI libraries if you're trying to do it for maximum compatibility. And what a lot of people have ended up doing is you get things like Bootstrap, right? Like Bootstrap is the ultimate version of this where we just create this overall library, can style everything across our component library, and that's all that we care about, right? Like we don't care if they collide within that as long as we have this overall way of describing our styles. But in a component world, that doesn't work very well. So what you see here is an example. This specific one is using style components, but it would look very similar regardless of what library you were using. And this is how we could style this button directly in the component. So for those of you that have used CSS-In-JS, this looks pretty familiar. So within my actual component, I'm able to describe my styles. And that expands when I want to be able to do this across multiple components. So I can have multiple buttons that have their own styles, and there's no way for them to collide with each other. So I end up with this nice little component that I can share wherever I want it to. And if somebody else in my company or somebody else in the community builds something else, we will stop those things from colliding because it's just one-to-one with the component. And this is very useful, especially for third-party libraries, your own internal component libraries, and shared styles and style guides. What you're trying to do is you're trying to come up with a way where I can create a piece of UI that has everything on board, and I can use it wherever I want to use it, and regardless of the surrounding code, I do not have to worry about the impact that that is going to have on my particular component. So there's a little bit of magic going on behind the scenes with CSS-In-JS to make sure that this can happen. Because you can imagine if I pull in 50 components or I create like a 100 component library for my company, there's a lot of CSS flying around. So we drew a lot of inspiration from other attempts to do this in the CSS community. So there was Object-Oriented CSS by Nicole Sullivan, Smacks by Jonathan Snook, and probably the most relevant is BEM by Yandex. So for those of you that are not familiar with BEM, BEM is the concept of creating classes in a way that will avoid having conflicting code. So you have this concept of block, element, and modifier that is used to describe your particular component, and with the hopes that that will be unique and keep you from having any collision of styles with other components. One of the big challenges of that is, much like everything else in CSS, you're trying to keep it up here in your brain. And when you have to do that across an entire organization or sometimes in disjointed communities that happen to be using your third-party library, it doesn't scale very well. As a concept, it is great. The execution of it is quite clunky. So we go back to the original example where I've created this base buttons, and this is a base button style, and these are the styles that all the buttons across my library will use. And then at the bottom here, I have two instances of that button that I've created where I've made a specific cancel button and a specific submit button that extends the styles of that original base button into these two new buttons. And what that ends up compiling down to is what you see here. So basically what we're doing is we're taking the styles that are in that block for that component, and we are hashing that into a unique class name. Now, the class name, for all intents and purposes, is gibberish, but what we end up getting is that BEM functionality, because now any component I have across my entire stack that shares those exact styles will get that class name, which keeps it from getting bloated. But if I add even one additional style to that block, it will get a completely new hash, and I do not have to worry about those colliding. The next thing I want to talk about is portability of styles. So portability of styles is a little bit different. For those of you that have used Sass or Less or Stylus, this is the concept of mix-ins. There's this particular complicated feature of CSS that I want to implement and I want to use over and over again. It takes a lot of CSS. I want some way to kind of pass that around. And in the past, this has been traditionally done with mix-ins where I go and I Google it and I find it sitting on some site and then I cut and paste it into my project and I import it and I've got my mix-in and everything's hunky-dory. But there's not a good way of doing that repeatably. We look at a Sass mix-in like this, and this particular one is for a concept called CSS locks, which is a fairly complicated formula that determines fluid transition between two breakpoints. So if I want to go from like 300 pixels to 600 pixels, and I want to scale dynamically between those two, this is the formula that does it for you. You would not want to write this over and over again every time you did it. So this is what it looks like implemented in Sass. This is what it looks like implemented in JavaScript. Almost exactly the same with some syntax changes. Now I have a piece of code, like anything else that I could throw on NPM, that I can share anywhere. And this is one of the beauties of writing your styles in this way, is now I can create this as an individual component or a library of components that I can share with others so that people within my organization or people who use my third-party library can get this CSS functionality directly in their components using NPM or Yarn, whatever your package manager of choice is. So now, if I want to do a CSS lock on a container, it's as simple as going to NPM and installing this package that I've created, importing it in like any other module in JavaScript, and then just using object.assign, or in this case, I'm using object spread to add it to that style declaration block at the top of my component. And now I have this CSS that previously was buried somewhere in some Sass repo that I had to pull out manually. And this is what we did when we created Polished. Polished is a library of about 60 modules that is the same type of stuff you'd see in Compass or Bourbon, just common CSS things that are super annoying to do over and over again. And now we've just made them a bunch of modules that you can go in and just import individually and add to your code just like you would anything else in JavaScript. The next benefit is inlining of critical CSS. So critical CSS is something that has come about as a result of Google and their page speed algorithms telling us that the fastest way and the best practice to get our page to load quickly is to take the CSS that is needed to initially render the page and inline it at the top in a style block. There are tools out there. There's a tool called Critical by Adiosomni that will try to do this automatically for you. But as you can imagine, it's not an easy thing. Like, I need to know what I'm actually seeing on the screen, and every time something changes on the page, I'm having to go manually update the CSS that I'm now inlining at the top of my page. It's a manual process. It requires build tools to automate, and even that does not work very well. And if you were to go and ask 100 developers the things they do to make their pages faster, half of them wouldn't mention it, and the other half would probably be like, oh, that's so much work for so little benefit, I'm not even going to bother. But this is all you have to do to get this when you do it in CSS-In-JS, because it is a feature of how CSS-In-JS works. Because at runtime, the page is automatically writing its CSS to the top, When you render on the server, you automatically get that style sheet already generated for you. So it's already inlined at the top in a style block, just like Google asks you to do. And if your page goes and changes, updates dynamically, all that stuff is automatically just comes on board with CSS and JS. So you're getting that extra performance benefit out of it without doing that extra work. Nothing new in your build step, and it's just right there from the start. The next piece is styles for every platform. So this is something that we are a little new at and we're still trying to figure out. So one of the promises of React in general is this ability to write code once and render to any platform. And sometimes those platforms are a little crazy, like Word docs and other strange use cases that we've come up with for React. But styles are still a problem. We don't have a good way to style a component that needs to be displayed on the web in React Native, in React VR. We're just not quite there yet. So we've got this concept of React primitives, and you've probably seen either React primitives or there's React Native Web. These concepts of trying to come up with React components that have versions of that can target different platforms, right? I write this view once, and that view becomes a div on the web. It becomes a web view in iOS, et cetera, et cetera. How can we also do this from a styling perspective? And that is something that not only Style Components, but Glamorous and a few other libraries are working on to give you the ability to write your styles in regular run-of-the-mill CSS and have them translated into styles that work well across all platforms. So if you look at the example that we have here, it doesn't look any different than what I showed you earlier. We have this view component. I've applied a background color, some text color to it, and this will do all the magic behind the scenes in order to style it both for the web as well as native devices. And we also give you the ability to go in and do things that are unique to the native platforms, because not everything that's available in CSS is available on native, and there's also a whole slew of other styling options on native that we don't have access to in regular CSS. So we try to create the ability for you to use things like font variant and text shadow offset and work with the pixel-based measurement units that are in native versus the pixel or percentage-based ones or rems or ems or whatever you happen to be using in CSS itself. And we're trying to figure out a way to kind of bridge that gap so that you can write styles across the board for everything. We're not quite there yet. For any of you who've worked with React Native as well as React for the web, you know that there are quite a few differences that's going on there. Because we don't have one-to-one for everything, how do we describe to the user that, hey, this rule you use just doesn't exist in CSS? Do we ignore it? Do we tell the user that's the case? There's still a lot of things to figure out here, but this is one of the things that excites me the most because this feels like that missing link between really having code that can work everywhere and where we're kind of at now. We're doing a really good job on the JavaScript side, we're doing a good job on the markup side, but we haven't quite got there from a styling perspective yet. One talk I would definitely consider checking out is today in this hall at 2:40, Peggy Ray's this is going to be talking about write once, render anywhere, which is going to expand on the concept generally of going in and what does it look like to write to both React Native as well as the web and what are some of the styling challenges they're running into. So if you're interested in this topic, definitely check that out because she's going to dive a lot deeper on that. So what's the catch? I've been up here, everything's great, it's awesome, everybody should sign up and use it all, you're silly if you're not. There's still a lot of things that we need to figure out, and a lot of it falls into form versus function. So because we're not actually writing CSS, there is some processing that needs to happen. What's the right way to get adoption? So if you have used things like Glamorous or Emotion or Style Components, you've seen what is really an attempt to bring this to every developer, because not everybody feels comfortable writing JavaScript, and if we're going to get this model with enough critical mass to get people to pay attention, it has to be more than just React developers going in and writing JavaScript. So you see these more CSS-like APIs where you're doing the string interpolation that Style Components has, where it's literally like writing CSS in a CSS file, versus what the trade-off is a smaller library, but writing them as objects, which feels very natural to us as JavaScript developers, but not so natural to maybe a UI developer that only spends their time writing HTML or writing regular CSS. So how do we balance those two things? And that's why you see kind of this divergence where you have ones that are trying really, really hard to be adopted, but maybe are larger libraries because they need to process that CSS ahead of time, versus the ones that are smaller and object-based, but they have a higher barrier to entry for everybody to use, especially if you only are used to writing CSS. This also dovetails into the build versus performance concept. So if you are not rendering to the server, you have a regular single page app, and you use something like style components, you're going to run into an issue where we're doing a lot of this stuff at runtime. Because we are evaluating JavaScript just like we do for your component in JSX, the CSS is generated at the time of render. And that, as you can imagine, can get expensive depending on what you have going on the page. But we don't require any special build process for that. You don't need to install any Babel or Webpack plugins. You can just run and gun, and it does what it needs to do. But you are going to have a slower runtime hit. Now, you can go a little bit further, and if you look at a library like Emotion, which has been gaining a lot of popularity, you have an extra build step, and you put in a plugin, but then I have very little to no runtime impact. So us trying to find the balance between those two is another thing that we're working quite a bit as a community to solve, because it's amazing. We will gladly install like a 300 kilobyte library to like show a timer, but if we have to install like 12 kilobytes for CSS, it's the end of the world. So we have to figure out where that balance is. So I definitely, if this is a topic that interests you, and if I had to write a new app right now, Emotion by Kai Hohenberger is definitely the one that I would check out. I think he has found a nice balance between those concepts. He has a CSS-like API similar to style components, has a very small library size. I want to say it's like 6 KB. And he has incredible performance because anything that's static, he's extracting immediately as part of the build. And given in the React community, a good portion of us are already using Webpack. It's kind of a small thing for us to add one more plugin in there and to get this performance. So really the only runtime impact you have is for any dynamic styles that you might be working with. Another small thing that I have to mention is security. So who would have known that accepting user input in JavaScript was a bad thing if you did not sanitize it? This is just a friendly reminder that we are doing string interpolation, tag template literals with a lot of these CSS-like APIs. And if you're accepting user input and generating styles based off that user input, you have to sanitize that. There are some security vulnerabilities specifically with string interpolations in JavaScript that I'm not going to bore you with, but definitely check out these articles if you're interested in learning a bit more about that. But the CSS escape library by Matthias is amazing and kind of the de facto in the community right now to get around that security problem. This probably will not be the only one we come across, so it's definitely something keeping in mind as you're moving your code base over to CSS-In-JS. So if this all sounds great and you're not already using it and you're sold, this is the best place to start. So I've thrown this bit.ly link up. This is a GitHub repo that has examples of practically every popular CSS and JS library you can check out, along with, most importantly, benchmarks on both library size, render performance across a bunch of different situations as far as like how big the page is and how many styles you're rendering. Definitely worth checking out. There is a lot of good resources there. There's also a ton of articles linked at the bottom if you want to read about more. It's still a very heavy effort to move from regular CSS over to CSS and JS, so it's worth you putting this little extra effort in at the beginning to make sure that you don't have to backtrack later. One of the other flaws, I'd say, of the community we have right now is everybody's just trying to make their APIs a little bit better. So there's enough difference in APIs across the different libraries that there will be some pain if you're trying to swap between them. So this is definitely something worth checking out. Another amazing article that you'll want to read is Unified Styling Language by Mark Dalgleish. He goes super in-depth into a lot of these topics. He's also the creator of CSS modules, which is a competitor of CSS and JS. So you get a different perspective, and he's very positive about why we're going the direction that we're going and kind of how we got there. So even if you're not sold necessarily on CSS and JS as a concept, you can kind of see him talk about where he sees the common threads between what he's trying to do with CSS modules versus what the CSS and JS community is trying to do. And if you think this is all disgusting and you just want to write your CSS as normal and you think we're all crazy and we're just trying to reinvent the wheel, you have options out there. It's not as integrated as we'd like it to be, which is why we're pushing forward with CSS and JS, but there are options out there for you to try to mimic this functionality in your components. So the aforementioned CSS modules is probably the most complete solution out there. They are still moving forward with the Polymer and Web Components standard, so you can look at what's going on there. There is the more traditionally used and what a lot of you may be using, which is the Webpack CSS loader, which is that concept of just importing a CSS file at the top of your components, and Webpack does some magic to kind of inline that CSS for you. That is, of course, still an option. And probably the most exciting thing for me, which it seems so small, which is CSS variables, because CSS variables is giving you that ability not only to do things like theming and the stuff we think of Sass for, but they can be dynamically updated using JavaScript. So if you want to have these dynamic styles and you don't want to feel dirty by just like swapping class names around, which is the traditional way of doing it, you can do it with CSS variables. So I wanted to leave with this tweet. So Sunil Pai is the creator of Glamour, which is kind of, in my opinion, the father of all the CSS and JS libraries. You'll find that a lot of them have this as kind of their back-end code. And he says, brain dump, I don't want CSS and JS to win. I want it to be obsoleted. And I think this summarizes our feeling as a community. We do realize to a certain extent we're trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to bring CSS into JavaScript because it's a language that we know that we have a lot more control over to try to show what is possible. Our ultimate goal is to get this to be part of the browser platform, right? If we could do all this natively with regular CSS, I think a lot of us would be okay with it. So the goal here is not for us to say we can do it better, everybody should just stop writing CSS, it's a horrible language, why does anybody do it? It's to say, here's where we have the most control, here's the other language that most front-end developers know, and we want you to take what we're doing here and bring it in natively to the platform. And that's it. Thank you very much. If you guys have any questions, feel free to grab me afterwards, and I'll be glad to answer them.